Marlene Kovak had greased the floor of Bay 4 for 11 years. The morning the line died, not one of the 30 men in that bay thought to ask the woman with the mop. 2 machinists stepped over her bucket to reach the dead press. She did not look up. She kept wiping the rail she knew better than her own hands. Then, Foreman Hollis Prewitt climbed the platform. He waved $500 bills in the air. "Fix this deadline, and 5,000's yours. Any man on this floor." Then he saw the wrench in her fist. He smirked. "Not you, sweetheart. Go find your broom." 30 men laughed. 300 jobs hung on that shift. Marlene set down the mop. She pulled a worn brass feeler gauge from her apron. Behind Prewitt, bolted to the wall, hung an old blueprint. 2 initials were inked in the corner. Nobody had read them in years. If you believe respect is earned in silence, this story is for you. Before we go further, subscribe to this channel, and do me one favor. Comment the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this one travels, because in the next hour, a woman everyone called the cleaning lady is going to hand a foreman his own $5,000. Stay with me. Corliss, Michigan, the spring of 1971. It was a diner and smokestack town. 1 main street, 1 traffic light that blinked yellow after 9, and 1 plant. Renner Stamping and Axle sat at the end of Mill Road, a long brick building with tall windows gone gray from 40 years of soot. When the plant breathed, the town breathed. Every family on those streets ate off what came out of Bay 4. Marlene got there before the sun. She always did. She came in through the side door by the loading dock, the one with the broken latch nobody had fixed since Eisenhower. She hung her coat on the 3rd hook. It was her hook, not by any rule, by 11 years of habit. She was 54, wide through the shoulders. Gray was coming in at her temples now, and she'd stopped fighting it. Her hands were the hands of a woman who worked. Knuckles thick. Palms lined with a black that never fully washed out, no matter the soap. She wore a shop apron gone stiff with old oil, and under it a plain flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow. Her title, if you asked payroll, was floor help. $2.10 an hour. She swept. She greased the ways and the rails. She hauled the swarf barrels out to the bin, and when a machinist needed to hit the john, or wanted a smoke, or just needed 10 minutes to sit down, she stepped in and ran his station. She relieved half the men in that bay. She never once got a machinist's wage for it. Nobody had ever offered. She had never once asked. She knew that plant the way a mother knows a sleeping house. She knew it by sound. Every press in the bay had a voice, and she'd learned them all. The old brake press near the wall had a wheeze on the downstroke. The number 2 stamper barked, and the transfer line, the long automated line that ran the length of Bay 4, that one hummed. It hummed low and steady and even, a sound under all the other sounds, and Marlene could hear it from the coat hooks. She could hear it from the parking lot on a still day. She loved that line. She'd never have said the word out loud, but she loved it the way you love a thing you understand all the way to the bottom. The transfer line took a flat blank of steel in at one end. It stamped it, moved it, formed it, moved it again, and dropped a finished axle housing out the far end. Station to station, in rhythm, hands free. The steel walked itself down the line. 40 years of Renner axles had come off machines like it. This one stamped 40,000 housings a month, and it never missed its beat. That morning, Marlene did what she always did. She filled the first pot of coffee in the brake shack. She carried a cup out to Emil Corso at the number 3 station. Black, no sugar, the way he took it. Emil was Danny's father, a quiet man, thick in the wrists, 30 years on the floor. He nodded at her over the steam. "Cold one," he said. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. Danny came in behind his father, jacket zipped to the chin. 19, all elbows still. He was the apprentice, which meant he fetched and swept and got yelled at, and mostly he trailed Marlene because Marlene was the one person on that floor who answered his questions straight. He had an eager, quick face. Dark hair he could never keep flat. "Morning, Miss Kovak." "Danny." "Cold one," he said, the same as his father, and grinned because he thought it was funny. She almost smiled. She went back to her rail. The shift change whistle blew at 6. The night crew shuffled out. The day crew shuffled in. And in that 1 minute of overlap, with half the men still pulling on gloves and half still stamping their cards, the transfer line died. It did not sputter. It did not grind. It just stopped. Mid-stroke. The hum cut out, and the whole long machine froze with a blank of steel still clamped in the first station, half-formed, going nowhere. The silence was the loudest thing that had happened in that bay in years. For a second, nobody moved. Then, everybody moved at once. Men crowded the drive end. Somebody hit the reset. Nothing. Somebody hit it again. Nothing. The line sat dead as a stone. Marlene stood by the wall with her rag in her hand, and she felt her stomach go cold. Not because of the noise, because of the no noise. It was like a heart she'd listened to for 11 years had simply stopped in front of her. Word ran through the plant faster than any man could walk. By 6:15 the shift super was down. By 6:30 the front office knew. And by 7, everyone in Corliss who had a stake in that building, which was everyone, understood the shape of the problem. The Kessler tractor contract. 40,000 axle housings. Due at the loading dock at 6 o'clock Friday morning. Kessler was the plant's biggest account, and the account had a clause. Missed the delivery, and corporate up in Detroit got the right to call the Corliss operation what they'd been itching to call it for 2 years. Obsolete, unviable, old iron in an old town. They'd condemn the plant, ship the work south to a newer building, and turn the lights off on Mill Road for good. 300 jobs. Emil Corso's job. Walt Sindelar's job. Danny's job. And, though nobody counted it, Marlene's job too. 4 days. That's what the deadline left them. 4 days to move a machine that wasn't moving. Hollis Prewitt came down from the office at 7:45, and he came down slow. Prewitt was the day shift foreman. 41. He wore a tie on the floor, which no foreman before him had ever bothered to do, and he kept his shirts white in a place where nothing stayed white. He had ambition the way some men have a limp, you could see it in how he walked. He hated the old machines. He said so, often, called them relics. Said the whole plant was a museum that hadn't figured out it was closed yet. He looked at the dead line, and Marlene watched his face, and she saw something there that didn't fit. The other men looked sick. Prewitt looked calm. Underneath the frown he put on for the crowd, he looked almost pleased. "Well," Prewitt said, loud enough to carry, "there she is. Worn-out iron finally quit on us. I've been telling Detroit for a year this heap was living on borrowed time." He put his hands on his hips. Nobody's fault. You can't fix old age. Walt Sindelar spat on the floor. Walt was 67, the oldest hand in the bay, 3 weeks from his retirement and not one bit afraid of Prewitt or anybody else. That line ran clean at shift change, Walt said. Machines don't die of old age at 6:01 on the nose. They die when they die, old man, Prewitt said. Marlene said nothing. She wheeled her bucket down the length of the deadline, wiping as she went. Invisible as ever. But her eyes moved. She looked at the drive housing. She looked at the couplings. And she looked, for just a second, at the pressure gauge on the hydraulic feed, and something in the needle sat wrong. It sat too low, not dead, just wrong, by a hair. The kind of wrong nobody notices unless they've watched that same needle 5,000 mornings. She frowned. She filed it away. She kept wiping. Behind her, At the wall, Walt had drawn Danny aside. The boy was rattled, asking questions, and Walt was answering low, the way old men talk when they're remembering. "You know that line wasn't always like the rest," Walt said. "The transfer redesign." 63. Whole thing got rebuilt off a sketch nobody upstairs wanted to sign. He shook his head. Best piece of machine work ever came through this shop, and it came off a piece of paper they near threw in the trash. Danny didn't understand it. He was 19. It was just old-timer talk. But the camera of his attention followed Walt's eyes, and Walt's eyes went to the blueprint bolted to the brick wall behind the platform, the big yellowed print of the transfer line, curling at one corner, the corner with 2 faded initials inked into it. And Marlene, passing by with her bucket, reached out without thinking and pressed that curling corner flat against the wall. Smoothed it with her thumb, the way you'd straighten a photograph in your own house. Then she moved on, and nobody saw it, and nobody thought a thing of it. By 11 o'clock the floor had tried everything easy, and nothing had worked. And the mood had gone from panic to something worse. Something quiet. Men stood in knots, not working. Because there was no work, the whole bay ran off that line. Emile Corso sat on an upturned crate with his cap in his hands and stared at the floor. He was thinking about his mortgage. You could see it. That's when Prewitt made his move. He climbed up onto the platform at the drive end, up where everyone could see him, and he clapped his hands twice for attention. "All right. Listen up, all of you." He waited until the bay went still. "Mr. Renner's driving in at noon. When he gets here, corporate's on the phone right after. So here's the situation. Plain. This line's got to run. Or Friday we lose the Kessler job, and you all know what that means." Nobody said anything. They all knew what it meant. "Now I don't think it can be done," Prewitt said. "I'll be honest with you. I think this machine's finished. But I'll tell you what." And here he reached into his coat, and he pulled out a fold of bills, and he peeled them off one at a time so every man could count them. 5 of them. Hundreds, $5,000. My own money. Cash, today in the hand, to any man on this floor who can restart this line before the owner gets here at noon. $5,000. In 1971, in Corliss, Michigan, that was a year's wage. That was a house down payment. That was more money than most men in that bay had ever held at once. The floor stirred. Men looked at each other. It was a cruel kind of hope, and Prewitt knew exactly what he was doing with it. He was making theater. He was proving a point, in front of witnesses, that no one here was smart enough to save the thing, so that when the owner came, and later when Detroit asked, the answer would already be written. We offered $5,000. Best men on the floor couldn't do it. Machine's dead. Scrap it. Marlene stood at the edge of the crowd. Her mop was in her hand, and some small, stubborn thing in her chest, something 11 years of silence had never quite killed, made her take one step forward. She didn't say a word. She just lifted the wrench she carried in her apron loop. Half a gesture. A question, almost. I could look. Prewitt saw it. Of course he saw it. His whole face changed, and he smiled the way a man smiles at a child who's said something adorable. "Not you, sweetheart." He said it soft, so it would carry. "Go find your broom." And the bay laughed. Not all of them. Walt didn't. Danny didn't. Danny went red to his ears. Emile looked away. But enough of them laughed. Enough of the 30 men in that bay let out that easy, thoughtless bark of a laugh, the kind that costs the laugher nothing and the one laughed at everything, that the sound of it filled Bay 4 and bounced off the dead machine and came back doubled. Marlene lowered her eyes. She did not argue. She did not flush. She did not say the thing she could have said, the thing that would have stopped every laugh in that room cold. She simply bent, and picked her mop back up off the floor where she'd leaned it, and turned and went back to her rail. If you were there, you'd have thought nothing of it. Just the cleaning lady, put back in her place. Nobody watched her go. But watch her hands. The rag moved over the rail, slow and even, and her eyes, down low where no one looked, were fixed on that hydraulic gauge with the needle sitting a hair too low. And behind her calm, plain face, something was working. Something was counting. Something that had drawn every line of that machine on a drafting board 8 years before any man in this room had touched it. She said nothing. She waited. She'd been waiting 11 years. She could wait a little longer. The first man to take the wager was Roush. Roush was 26, a set-up man, quick and loud and sure of himself in the way only a young man who's never been badly wrong can be. He rolled up his sleeves to a whistle from his buddies and went at the drive end like he was going to arm wrestle it. "It's the motor," he announced, before he'd touched a thing. 10-1 it's the drive motor. Burned out. I can smell it. He couldn't smell anything. Marlene, 20 feet away, knew it wasn't the motor. The motor was fine. If the motor had burned, you'd have heard it go, you'd have smelled the varnish cook off the windings, and you'd have found the line coasting to a stop, not slamming dead mid-stroke the way it had. A dead motor doesn't stop a machine on a dime. But Roush had a theory and an audience, and the two things together will make a young man deaf. He pulled the covers off the drive. He got his meter out. He spent 40 minutes chasing voltage through a motor that was answering every question exactly the way a healthy motor should. He didn't like the answers, because the answers didn't fit his theory. So he decided his meter was wrong and chased it again. Then he got frustrated. And a frustrated man with a pry bar is a dangerous thing on a jammed machine. He decided the index was stuck, and he went at the mechanism with the bar to free it up, and he cranked it against the jam instead of with it, and something down in the transfer let out a short, ugly crunch. Marlene winced. She actually shut her eyes. Roush had just taken a clean jam and made it a mess. Whatever had stopped the line was still there, and now there was a bent finger in the number 2 transfer bar on top of it. He'd added damage. He stepped back, sweating, and looked at the still-dead machine, and his face finally caught up with his mouth. "Motor's fine," he admitted. He didn't look at anybody. "It ain't the motor. An hour gone. The line worse than before." Prewitt, up on his platform, didn't say a word. He just smiled and looked at his watch, and the smile said everything. "See? Best young hands on the floor. Can't be done." The clock on the bay wall read 9:10. The second attempt was serious. Boyd was the maintenance lead, and Boyd was no fool. 50, careful, 25 years in. When Boyd rolled his cart over, the whole floor took a breath, because if anyone was going to do it the honest hard way, it was him. He brought 2 men with him. He brought the big prints, the maintenance sheets, not the wall blueprint, the thick binder of service diagrams. He laid them out on a bench, and the 3 of them studied them like men reading a will. "We do this right," Boyd said. "We pull the index unit. We get eyes on the whole transfer train. Something's seized in there, we find it, we clear it, we button it back up." He looked at the clock. "It's a 2-hour job done clean. We've got till noon. Let's go." And they went at it right. Marlene watched them and, for the first time all morning, felt something close to relief, because these were men who knew what they were doing. They pulled the guards. They broke the couplings loose, careful, marking each one. They got the index unit unbolted and swung it back on the chain hoist, 4 hands steady on it, and got their heads and their lamps down into the guts of the transfer, where nobody could see for the machine around it. The talk from in there was real machinist talk. Bearings, end float. Cam followers. They checked the followers one by one and found them tight. They spun the index shaft by hand, and it spun. They traced the linkage and found it free. Everything they could see and touch and turn was fine. Every part of that machine, examined on its own, was healthy. And the line stayed dead. That was the thing that broke them. Not a hard fault, not a snapped shaft or a seized bearing they could hold up and blame. Everything worked, and the machine didn't. Boyd came up out of the transfer with grease to his elbows and sweat-cutting lines through the black on his face. And he stood there, and he shook his head, and he said the worst 4 words a maintenance man can say. I don't get it. They put the index unit back. It took another 40 minutes, and it changed nothing, because they'd never found the thing to change. Boyd rolled his cart back to the wall in a silence so complete you could hear the fluorescent lights buzz. Marlene had watched every minute of it. And she knew why Boyd had failed. She'd known before he started. Boyd had checked every part for what it was. He hadn't checked a single part for whether it was in the right way. Because why would he? A cam that's been in a machine 8 years doesn't get checked for orientation. You check it for wear. Boyd had spun the index shaft and felt it turn free and crossed it off. He never asked whether it was time to turn at the right moment. He was looking for something broken. And nothing was broken. Her stomach was cold again, colder than before, because a picture was forming in her mind and she did not like it. The clock read 11. 1 hour to noon. Prewitt made a phone call. He did it up in the office, but Danny was near the stairs and heard the shape of it and told Walt, and Walt's face went hard. A little before 11:30, a car nobody knew pulled into the lot, and a man in a good coat got out with a clipboard he never opened. Prewitt walked him onto the floor like a visiting doctor. "This here's a specialist," Prewitt announced. "Transfer systems. He's consulted for us before." He hadn't. "Let's get a professional opinion, since our own people are stumped." The specialist walked the length of the line. He did not take off his coat. He did not touch a wrench. He looked at the drive, and he looked at the index, and he crouched once and looked at nothing in particular, and he stood back up and brushed off his knees, though he hadn't knelt in anything. Well, he said. He said it to Prewitt, but loud, for the room. "I've seen a lot of these old transfer systems in my time. And I'll be straight with you. This one's done. The wear pattern's all through it. You're looking at metal fatigue up and down the train. You could sink a month and a fortune into it, and you'd be chasing your tail. My honest professional recommendation?" He shrugged. "Beyond economical repair. Time to look at a new system." And there it was, the exact words Prewitt needed, beyond economical repair. A specialist said it. There were witnesses. Now when Renner came, and when Detroit called, the paper was written and signed. We tried. We even called a professional. He said scrap it. Marlene stood by her bucket and understood the whole shape of it at last. All of it, cold and clear. The needle sitting low, the line dying clean at 6:01. Boyd finding nothing broken, because nothing was broken. The specialist who read fatigue off a machine he never touched. A foreman who looked pleased at a funeral. This machine hadn't died. Somebody had killed it. And every move this morning had been aimed at getting it declared dead before anyone with the right eyes could kneel down and look at the body. The men were deflating around her. You could feel it leave them. The hope, going out of the bay like heat out of an open door. Emil Corso put his cap back on and stood up off his crate. And the way he stood up was the way a man stands who's decided to stop hoping so it'll hurt less when it comes. 300 jobs. 4 days. And now a specialist had said the word. And who were they to argue with a specialist? Danny Corso couldn't stand it. The boy had been watching Marlene all morning. He didn't have the years to know a burned motor from a good one. But he had eyes, and what his eyes had seen was this. Every time one of these men made a guess, Marlene's face had changed. Not much. A flicker. When Rausch said motor, her mouth had gone flat. No, when Boyd pulled the index, her eyes had followed his hands with something like hope and then something like pity. And when the specialist said fatigue, Danny had been looking right at her. And he'd seen her whole face close like a door. She knew. Whatever the answer was, she knew it. Danny was as sure of that as he'd ever been of anything. And he was 19, and too green to be heard, and about to open his mouth anyway. She could fix it. He didn't mean to say it that loud. It came out into a lull, and it carried, and heads turned. Danny felt his face go hot, but he was in it now. He pointed. Miss Kovak. She could fix it. She knows this line better than anybody in here. Somebody snorted. Somebody else laughed, but the laugh died halfway, because Walt Sindelar had stepped forward, and Walt wasn't laughing. The boy's right, Walt said. His old voice was rough, but it filled the quiet. You want to know why she knows this line? He looked around the bay, at all these men, half of whom he'd trained. Because she built it. The word landed, and sat there. 63, Walt said. That redesign I've been telling you pups about for years, the sketch nobody upstairs wanted to sign. You want to know whose sketch? He turned and pointed one crooked finger at the blueprint bolted to the wall, at the yellowed print of the very machine standing dead in front of them. It's on the paper. Been on the paper the whole time. In the corner. Where none of you ever bothered to look. Every eye in Bay 4 went to the wall. To the print, to the corner that Marlene had smoothed flat with her thumb that morning out of pure habit, the corner with two faded initials inked into it. M.K. Prewitt came down off his platform fast. That's enough. That's a nice story, Walt, but we've got a professional's assessment and a noon deadline, and I'm not going to stand here and let this floor turn into a let her look, Emile Corso said. It was the first thing Emile had said all morning. He said it quiet, and he said it looking straight at Prewitt, and something in it stopped the foreman's mouth. Emile Corso didn't talk much. When he did, men listened. We got nothing left to lose here, Hollis, Emile said. Your specialist says it's scrap. Can't hurt scrap by letting her look at it. Can it? And the bay, that whole roomful of men who'd laughed 2 hours ago, went silent and waiting. They all turned to Marlene. For 11 years she had wanted exactly this, and never once expected it. And now that it was here, the old habit rose up in her first. The reflex of a woman who'd been made small so long she'd forgotten she was ever any other size. She shook her head. Just slightly. Not me. It wasn't fear of the machine. It was the deeper thing. The certainty, worn smooth into her over 11 years, that she was not the one they asked, that she never would be, that the wanting had been foolish all along. She looked down at her hands. Then she looked up. And she looked, not at Prewitt, and not at Walt, but at Emile Corso, who'd stood up off his crate and given up his hope so it wouldn't hurt. She looked at the cap in his hands. She thought about the mortgage in his face. She thought about Danny, 19 and red-eared and defending her in front of 30 men who could make his apprenticeship hell for it. She looked at the $500 bills still folded in Prewitt's coat pocket, the corner of them showing. And she looked at the clock on the wall. 11:09. Something moved across her face then, and Danny, watching, saw it, and would remember it the rest of his life. The pain went out of it. And something else came in and took its place. Something that had been under there the whole time, folded up small, and kept in the dark for 11 years. The way you'd keep a good tool wrapped in oilcloth in a bottom drawer. She set the mop against the dead press. She did not say a word. She did not accept the bet out loud. She did not answer Walt, or Danny, or Emile, or the specialist in his good coat. She simply reached into her apron and took out the one wrench and the worn brass feeler gauge. the little gauge gone smooth and golden from 30 years of her thumb, and she wiped her greased hands slow on the front of her apron. And she walked toward the machine she had drawn on a board in 1963 and had never once, in 11 years, been allowed to touch. The whole bay watched her go. Nobody laughed now. Prewitt found his voice, and when he found it, it came out wrong. Too high, trying for the old joke and missing it. "You've got till noon, sweetheart." Not one man in that room so much as smiled. Marlene reached the drive end of the line. She laid her hand flat on the cold steel of the housing, the way you'd lay a hand on the flank of a horse to let it know you were there. She stood a moment with her back to all of them, and the clock on the wall ticked over to 11:10, and started counting the last hour of the plant's life, or the first hour of the rest of it. Her hand stayed flat on the steel a long moment. The metal was cold. It should not have been cold. A live line runs warm all through the shift, warm as a sleeping thing, and this one had gone to the temperature of the room. That told her the first true thing, before she ever picked up a wrench. This machine had not died an hour ago at shift change. It had been dead longer than that. Somebody had let it cool. She did not say so. Not yet. She walked the length of it instead. Slow, the way you walk a fence line after a storm, looking for the one post that came down. 30 men watched her do it, and not one of them breathed loud. Danny had come up close along the rail, close as he dared, his cap twisted in both hands. Walt stood back by the blueprint on the brick wall, and his old face had gone very still, because Walt was the only man in that bay who had seen her walk a line this way before. In 1963. When it was lines on a board, and not yet steel. Marlene stopped at the drive end. She crouched. The blueprint was bolted to the wall behind Prewitt, 10 feet off, and it hung a little crooked, the way it had hung for years. She did not go to it. She looked at it from where she crouched, upside down and sideways and 10 feet away, and she read it the way you read your own handwriting in the dark. "Clearance on the index carriage runs 4 1/4, she said. "Quiet, not to anybody. Not 4 even. Your man had it wrong." The specialist in the good coat made a small sound. He had said 4 even, 20 minutes ago, with his hands in his pockets. He looked at the print, now. He counted the little inked numbers with his eyes. His mouth closed. Nobody had told her the number. She had not gone and looked. She had carried it 11 years. She went to work. The first thing was the surface jam, and the surface jam was easy, and she knew it was easy. And she knew it was not the real thing. A transfer bar had come out of True where Roush had cranked on it that morning and bent it. It sat cocked against the housing rail, locking the whole index. Any fool could see it, once you knew to look. She took the wrench off her apron loop, backed off 2 bolts, set the heel of her hand against the bar, and walked it straight, with 3 short pushes. She felt its seat. She heard the little iron click of a thing going home. She stood back. "Try it," she said. Prewitt did not move. So Danny moved. Danny went to the drive box before anybody could tell him not to, and threw the lever, and the whole line shuddered, and every man in the bay leaned forward on the balls of his feet. It twitched. It caught. One stroke. The transfer arms swung, an axle housing lifted off the first station and started down the line, and for one whole second the machine was alive, and the bay drew one breath together. Then it hung. It hung at the top of the stroke like a man with a hand on his heart. And it died again. The breath went out of 30 men at once. Prewitt laughed. It was an ugly laugh, and it was too quick, the laugh of a man who had been more scared than he wanted anybody to know. "There it is," he said. "There's your grease monkey. Threw a bar straight. You want your 5,000 for that, sweetheart?" Kids in the yard can throw a bar straight. Marlene did not look at him. She was looking at the top of the stroke. At the place where it had hung. Because a machine that dies dead tells you nothing, but a machine that lifts and hangs and lets go, That machine is telling you exactly where the lie is. It had gotten one station in. It had failed at the timing. Not the motor, not the drive, the timing. She had been expected to fail right there, at the surface jam. Every man in the room had. They had waited for the bar to come straight and the line to stay dead and the woman to pick her mop back up. She had cleared it in 3 minutes, and the line had spoken to her on the way down, and now she knew where to put her hands. She moved to the timing case. That was when Prewitt came off the platform. "All right," he said. "That's enough. Owner's rules. No unqualified hands on the equipment when there's a contract on the floor." He was moving toward her now, quick, and his voice had climbed back up to that too high place. "You want to clean? You clean. You don't open that case. That's a firing thing. Step off." He got his hand halfway to her shoulder. And Walt Sindelar, 67 years old and 3 weeks from a pension, stepped in between the foreman and the cleaning lady, and he did it without hurry, the way an old dog gets up off a porch, and there was no give in him at all. "She's more qualified," Walt said, "than the piece of paper you've been standing in front of all morning." Prewitt stopped. "Move, old man." "No," Walt said, and out in the lot, through the big bay door that stood open to the spring morning, a car turned in off the county road. A long, dark car, moving slow over the gravel. August Renner's car. An hour early, the owner had heard his plant was dying, and he had not been able to sit in his house and wait for noon. Prewitt saw it. Everybody saw it. And something happened in the foreman's face that Danny would try to describe for years afterward and never quite get. A kind of math, running fast and coming out wrong. Marlene had the timing case open. She never looked up at the car, or at Prewitt, or at Walt with his arms loose at his sides and his old jaw set. She had the case open, and her thumb was already inside it, on the cam, and Walt. Walt saw where her hand went. Walt saw that she did not feel around for it. She did not hunt. Her palm went straight to the timing cam the way your hand goes to the light switch in your own front hall in the dark, and it laid flat against the face of it, and it stopped. Walt made a sound. Just a breath. But he had watched 1,000 men open that case over the years, and hunt. And he had never once seen a hand go home like that, and he knew, the way you know a voice on the phone before the first word is done, exactly who was standing at that machine. Marlene went very still. Her thumb moved along the edge of the cam. Once, back and her face, which had been the flat, closed, working face she wore for everything, changed. Anybody watching close saw it change. Danny saw it. It was not surprise. Exactly, it was worse than surprise. It was the face of a person who has found the thing she was afraid she would find. "This cam," she said. She said it low. The bay had gone so quiet the presses 2 aisles over sounded like they were in the room. "This cam is in backward." Boyd, the maintenance lead, the 50-year-old man with 25 years in, who had pulled the whole index unit that morning and found nothing, Boyd came off the wall. "It can't be backward. I had that whole train down. Everything torqued to spec." "Nothing was. Everything was torqued to spec," Marlene said. "Every part is good. You checked every part for wear, Boyd, and every part passed, and you went home in your head an hour ago because nothing was broken." She lifted her thumb off the cam. "Nothing's broken. That's the whole trick of it. A worn part, you'd have found. This cam isn't worn. It's turned around, lobes riding the follower 180 degrees out. It opens the transfer when it should close it, and closes it when it should open. The line lifts a housing and then times itself to drop it in the same breath." She looked at the cam like it was a person who had lied to her. "That doesn't happen by wear. A cam doesn't climb off its key and put itself back on backward in the night. The specialist in the good coat had gone the color of the concrete floor. Somebody, Marlene said, put it in that way. And now the whole bay was doing the math Prewitt's face had done a minute before, and the math was coming out to the same ugly number for all of them, and 30 men turned, slow, the way a field of sunflowers turns, and looked at the foreman on the platform. Prewitt's smile was still on his face, but it did not fit anymore. It sat there like a hat on the wrong man. Marlene reached up. 10 feet away, on the brick wall, the old blueprint hung crooked in its bolts, and she did not have to touch it, she only had to point, and she pointed at the bottom corner of it, where 2 small letters sat inked in a hand nobody upstairs had wanted to sign in 1963. "You see that," she said. "Loud enough now. Loud enough to carry. Down in the corner. Everybody's walked past it 8 years. M. period. K. period." She turned around, and for the first time in 11 years, in front of all of them, she used her own name like it was something she owned. M.K. Marlene Kovak. I drew this line in 1963. I sat at the board 4 months of nights after my shift, and I drew every station on it. And when it was done they built it exactly, and they bolted a staff man's nameplate on the drive end, and they gave me a mop. She said it flat. No heat. That was the terrible part, Danny thought. There was no heat in it at all. I have swept the floor under a machine I built for 11 years, and not one of you ever asked me a question about it. Because you all looked at the broom, and you never looked up. Nobody spoke. So I know this line, she said, the way you know your own kitchen in the dark. And I am telling you there is one more thing wrong with it. Because a reversed cam by itself would have thrown a fault the first shift after they did it, and they were smarter than that. They wanted it to run a while and then let go, so it looked like age. So it looked like the old iron finally quit. She crouched at the drive end again, and now she took the little brass feeler gauge off her apron. The one gone smooth and golden from 30 years of her thumb. There's a second thing. Down in the coupling, where nobody looks unless they built it. She slid the feeler gauge in along the shaft. The bay held still. Renner's car had stopped in the lot, and the car door had opened and shut. But nobody looked at that. Everybody looked at the woman on her knees at the drive end with a strip of brass thinner than a fingernail, reading a gap by feel the way another person reads a face. There, she said softly. To herself. To the machine. There you are. She reached in with 2 fingers, and she brought something out into the light, and she held it up between her thumb and her first finger, where the morning sun came through the bay door and struck it. It was a shaft key, a little wedge of steel, no bigger than a stick of gum, the thing that locks a shaft to its wheel, so the 2 turn as one. It should have had 4 square shoulders on it, bright and true. 2 of its shoulders had been filed down. Filed at an angle, careful, patient, so that under a hard load the key would ride up out of its seat and the shaft would slip, and the whole drive would lose its time and let go, and afterward, when they pulled it, the metal would look bright where it had slipped, and any man would call it fatigue, would call it a worn-out part on a worn-out line. Somebody sat with a file, Marlene said, and did this by hand. This is not wear. This is a Sunday afternoon, and a vise, and a steady hand. She turned the key in the light so the fresh file marks caught. This line didn't die, Hollis. She stood up. She was not a large woman, and she was 54 years old, and there was grease to her elbows, and when she turned to face the platform, she was the largest thing in the room. Somebody killed it, she said. And you're the only man on this floor who spent all morning keeping everyone away from the body. Hollis Prewitt opened his mouth. Nothing came out that was any use. He tried for the sneer, the old easy sneer that had carried him through 11 years of this bay, and it would not come. because a Sneered needs the room behind it, and the room had turned all the way around and left him standing up on that platform alone with $500 bills in his coat and no floor under his feet. "That's," he said. "You can't prove." A woman finds a bent key and starts. "I'm not going to prove anything," Marlene said. "I'm going to fix your line." And she turned her back on him. That was the worst of it, for Prewitt. Danny watched it land. She did not fight him, and she did not curse him, and she did not wait for him to answer. She simply turned her back, the way you turn your back on a thing you are done with, and she went back down on her knees at the drive end and got to work, and the whole bay turned its back on the platform with her. She had the spare keys in a little steel drawer on the maintenance bench, because she had specified that drawer in 1963, and she knew what was in it. She took a good key. She set the shaft in true. She pulled the cam, and she turned it a half-turn on its key, and she seated it the way it was drawn, the lobe reading the follower the way she had meant it to read the follower 8 years before any of these men had touched it. "Danny," she said. "Come here. Put your hand where mine is." He came and knelt beside her, and she put his young hand on the cam. "Feel that flat," she said. "That's home. When you set a cam, you don't torque it and hope. You feel it drop into true first. A machine tells you when it's right, if you shut up long enough to let it." She tightened the last bolt with the one wrench off her apron. "You remember that?" "Yes, ma'am," Danny said. She closed the case. She stood. She wiped her hands on the front of her apron, slow, the way she had wiped them 1,000 mornings, and she walked to the drive box, and she put her hand on the lever. She did not make a speech. She threw the drive. The transfer line clanked. It caught. Down its whole long steel length the stations woke one after another, and the transfer arms swung up in time. True time. And the first axle housing lifted clean off the first station and rode down to the second and dropped square. And the second arm took it and the third, and the line found its stroke and settled into it, and the stroke built into a rhythm, and the rhythm built into that great steady iron heartbeat that every man in that bay had heard 40 hours a week for the whole of his working life, and had not known he loved until the morning it stopped. 40,000 axle housings had a road to travel again. The line ran. Somebody hollered. Then all of them hollered. Boyd had his cap off and was hitting it against his leg. Roush, the young setup man who had bent the bar and burned an hour and called it a dead motor, Roush had both hands on top of his head and was laughing like a boy. Emile Corso, Danny's father, 30 years on that floor, a quiet man who had said maybe 6 words all morning, stood with his hand over his mouth and his eyes wet and shining. And Walt Sindelar looked up at the clock on the wall. The clock read 11 minutes short of noon. 51 minutes. They had given 30 men and 4 days, and she had done it, alone, in 51 minutes. Under the hour, Walt said, to nobody, to himself, to the god of old machinists. She did it under the hour. And that was when August Renner walked onto the floor of Bay 4. He was 70 years old, and he moved like it, a tall, spare man in a good gray hat, and he had heard the line die from his own driveway, and he had heard it come back to life as he crossed his own lot. And he came in through the noise with his hat still on, and stopped at the edge of the crowd, and looked at his running line the way a father looks at a child he'd been told was drowned. "Who?" he said. He had to say it twice to be heard over the machine. "Who did this?" Walt Sindelar took the old man by the elbow, and Danny came up on the other side. Red-eared and 19 and too green to be heard by any of these men on any other morning of his life, but they were all listening now. And between the two of them, the oldest hand in the bay and the youngest, they laid it out for the owner, plain, over the beat of the line. The wager, the 3 men who tried and failed, the specialist in the coat who never touched a wrench and pronounced it dead, and the cleaning lady. The redesign in 1963. The nameplate that said one thing and the corner of the print that said another. Renner listened. And then he did the thing that made him a qualified witness, and not just a rich old man taking a story on faith. He walked to the drive end of his own machine, and he put out his hand, and Marlene, without a word, laid two objects into it. The reversed cam, and the filed key. August Renner had come up on the floor himself, 50 years gone. He knew iron. He turned the cam in his fingers and read the lobe against the keyway, and his mouth went tight. He held the little filed key up to the light from the bay door exactly the way she had, and he saw the angle of it, the patient handwork of it, the two shoulders taken down clean with a file. And he was quiet a long time. Then he walked to the brick wall, and he bent down, and he read the corner of the blueprint that had hung in his plant for 8 years, and he read the two small inked letters, and he straightened up slow, and he turned, and he looked at the woman he had paid $2.10 an hour for 11 years. "Mrs. Kovak," he said. "It's Marlene," she said. "Marlene." He took his hat off. A 70-year-old man took his hat off to the cleaning lady on the floor of his own plant, and 30 men saw him do it. I have owned this line since it was a drawing, and I never once asked whose drawing it was. "No, sir," she said. "You didn't." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." Then August Renner turned around, and the softness went out of him, and he looked up at the platform where Hollis Prewitt still stood, and his voice, when it came, was the voice of a man who had built something with his hands 60 years ago and did not care to be lied to on the floor where he'd built it. "Hollis," he said. "Come down here." Prewitt came down. He came down because there was nothing else to do. He was working his face the whole way, hunting for the version of the morning where he came out fine, and there wasn't one, but a man like that keeps hunting anyway. "August," he said, "that machine was 30 years old. Anybody'll tell you it was on borrowed, the supplier said himself, a new transfer system. We'd have had it in by fall. No more of these, the supplier," Renner said. And it was not a question, but Prewitt answered it like one, and that was his mistake, because, in his hurry to have his answer ready, he had it too ready. "Coleman Systems, out of Flint, they quoted us a whole new line. I had the paperwork started weeks ago. I was only trying to." "You had it started weeks ago," Renner said, "before the line quit." The bay went quiet under the beat of the machine. Prewitt heard what he'd said. You could watch him hear it. "A man files a key on a Sunday," Renner said, slow, "so a good line will let go under load in the spring and look like it died of old age. And the same man has papers started weeks early with a supplier out of Flint to sell me a new one, and the same man phones that supplier's expert to come stand on my floor and tell my men the old line's beyond saving." He looked at the specialist in the good coat, who had begun, quietly, to move toward the door, and who stopped when the old man looked at him. You didn't touch a wrench. I'm told you never opened a case. You looked at a running man's life work for 90 seconds, and you called it dead." Renner nodded, once, like a thing was settled. "You'll wait right there. There's a fellow from the state coming who'll want your name and who's paying you." He turned back to Prewitt, and he held up the filed key between them. "What'd they cut you in for, Hollis?" he asked. Almost gentle. "On a whole new transfer line, 10%? Off the top of what you'd have talked me into paying out of scaring 300 people that their plant was finished?" Prewitt did not answer. There was no answer. The key was in the old man's hand, and the line was running behind them, and the name in the corner of the print was MK, and every road out of that morning was closed. "Get off my floor," August Renner said, and he walked the foreman to the gate himself. 70 years old, hat back on his head, he walked Hollis Prewitt the whole length of Bay 4, past every man who had laughed at 11 o'clock that morning, and not one of them laughed now. and out through the big door into the spring light, and he stood there and waited with him at the fence, the two of them, until the state industrial inspector's car came up the county road, because August Renner had stopped at the office telephone on his way in and made one call, and it was not to a supplier in Flint. That would have been enough. But there was still the money. Renner came back onto the floor. He walked to the platform where the wager had been made, where a foreman had fanned $500 bills at 30 men, 4 days deep in dread, and offered them to any man who could do the impossible, and offered them to any man at all so long as it was not the woman with the mop. The money was still in Prewitt's coat. The coat was over the rail on the platform where he'd left it, sure of himself, that morning. Renner reached into the pocket and took out the 5 bills, $500 bills, $5,000, and he held them a moment, and then he came down off the platform and he crossed the floor to Marlene Kovak in front of the same 30 men. The bet was $5,000, he said, to any man on this floor who could start this line before I got here. He looked around at all of them. Slow. I got here. It's running. And the only thing wrong with the bet is one word in the middle of it. He put the 5 bills into her greased hand, and he closed her fingers over them with both of his. It should have said any hand. You've got the best pair in this building. You always did. Marlene stood there holding $5,000 in a hand that had held a mop an hour before. Nobody who was there ever forgot what she did next. She looked at the money. She looked at the 30 men, Boyd, 50 years old, who'd pulled the whole unit and gone home in his head. Roush, 26, who'd bent the bar and burned the hour. All of them who had stepped over her bucket for 11 years to reach a machine she'd drawn. And she walked to the maintenance bench where the shift's relief tin sat, the dented coffee, can the men dropped nickels in for a fellow who got hurt or a widow at Christmas. She dropped all $500 bills into the can. For the men, she said, who worked 4 hours believing it couldn't be done. She wiped her hand on her apron. It's hard work, believing that. I know. I did it for 11 years. And that was all. No speech. No gloat. She turned around and she went and picked something up off the floor, and it was her mop, and for one bad second every man there thought she was going to go back to it, that the morning was going to close the way all the other mornings had closed. And something in the bay ached. But she only carried it to the wall and stood it in the corner where it belonged, out of the aisle, the way you put away a tool you're finished needing. Then the men came. They came one at a time, the way men like that do, no rush, a little shy of it. Boyd first. He put his cap on, and he took it back off, and he put out his hand, and she shook it, grease and grease. Then Roush, who couldn't meet her eye and shook her hand anyway, and muttered something that might have been sorry and might have been thank you, and was probably both. Old Walt just nodded at her from across the floor, and that nod said more than any of the handshakes, because Walt had known for 8 years and carried it alone. And last, Emile Corso. Danny's father, 30 years on that floor, the quiet man who that morning had said the 6 words that turned the whole thing, that had said, when nobody else would, that she ought to be let to try. He did not shake her hand. He came and he put his hand on her shoulder, once, the flat of it, the way a man does to his own brother, and he held it there a second, and he took it away. He never said a word. He didn't have to. He'd already said the only ones that mattered. The line ran. 40,000 Axel housings had until 6 o'clock Friday morning, and it was 1 minute short of noon, and they were going to make it. A year is a long time in a town like Corliss, and no time at all. The Kessler housings went out the loading dock at 6 o'clock Friday morning, all 40,000. And the penalty clause never got read, and the word unviable never came down from corporate, and the plant did not go south. It stayed on its one main street under its one traffic light, with its 40 years of soot on the brick. And it hummed. 300 jobs stayed 300 jobs. The diner stayed open. The Five and Dime stayed open. On a spring morning a year on, the whole town still ran on the heartbeat of a machine in Bay 4, and most of the people in it had heard the story by now of the morning it nearly stopped for good. There is a frosted glass door at the end of the office hall now. It did not used to have any letters on it. It has letters on it now, dark and clean, and they say Chief Engineer, and under that they say M. Kovak, behind the glass, on the desk, there is a worn brass feeler gauge, gone smooth and golden, sitting on top of a steel-cased notebook whose sketches, if you opened it, would match the blueprint on the Bay 4 wall line for line. The nameplate on the drive end of the transfer line got changed too. It took the maintenance shop about 10 minutes with a screwdriver. It says the right name now. Danny Corso is her apprentice. 19 turned 20. He comes in early, and he brings 2 coffees, the way he watched her bring his father coffee for years, and they stand at the rail in the morning light with the line running clean below them, the housings dropping in that steady rhythm, the tube radio in the corner playing something soft, the steam coming off the 2 cups. Walt Sindelar took his pension. He comes by sometimes on a slow afternoon, and he stands and watches the line, and one morning he said the thing that got repeated all over the plant. "Took 'em 8 years, Walt said to Rita Corner. And they don't talk about Hollis Prewitt much. But once, when Danny asked her straight out whether she ever thought about him, whether it ever ate at her, all those years, Marlene watched the line run a minute before she answered. "He learned some engineering in the end," she said. "From the outside of the fence." And that was all she ever said about it. She told Danny one more thing, that morning at the rail, and he wrote it in the front of his own notebook so he wouldn't lose it. "There's a difference," she said, "between being asked and being seen. They finally asked me, that morning, when the money was on the floor and they'd run out of men. But being asked isn't the thing. The thing is being seen, every ordinary day, before you're the only one left who can save them. Most people never get either. If you get to be the one who does the looking, boy, you look at the broom. You look at the person holding it. You ask." She picked up her coffee. "You'd be surprised who drew the building you're standing in." The line ran on below them, true and steady, the way it was drawn to run. If this one traveled all the way to your town, comment the name of it below. I want to see how far she gets.